All right, I'm pretty sure we've got everybody that we need now. I just ask that you keep yourselves muted, obviously, unless you have a question, just so that way there's no background noise or anything like that. When it comes to this chapter, it is very dry. It's very, we went through the first part of it. We're finishing up this last part of the chapter. Honestly, I'm gonna try to give you guys a break like every 40 slides. It's only roughly like 110 slides, so it shouldn't take us forever. But if I don't give you a break every now and then, like I learned with the class Monday, then I'm gonna lose you. So I'll try to help you guys out in that aspect. Before I get started, are there any questions in regard to anything that I might be able to answer for you guys? Or maybe a question that you might have after the fact or whatever it is, doesn't matter to me. Just make sure that if you do have a question, you're not just keeping to yourself, that I'm able to answer it for you. All right, so we covered roughly 100 slides of anatomy and physiology last week. Again, it's kind of dry, it's kind of bland. The bad part is I don't know why they spend so much time going through a lot of this stuff when we literally cover this exact module during medical emergencies next semester. We're going to cover endocrine emergencies, cardiovascular emergencies, circulatory emergencies, neurologic, psychologic, all the emergencies that we're used to dealing with, and how to treat them, how to recognize signs and symptoms with them. So some of this stuff we're going to cover again. This is just a brief intro to it, especially when it starts talking about organs. Don't think that that's all we're going to cover. There's going to be more to it, especially when we jump into the certain types of conditions that we're going to see with our patients. Somebody put they were having trouble hearing me. Are you guys able to hear me okay?
Yeah. I can hear you fine.
Just making sure.
Perfect.
Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. So first part, where we left off last, we just covered like the skeletal system. We covered the 206 bones of the body, which gives us our structure, gives us our frame. Now we're jumping very much into the musculoskeletal system. I don't expect you to know 600 muscles. I don't know 600 muscles. The muscles I know are our main muscles of, your bicep, tricep, quads, trapezius muscles, your pectoral muscles, ones that are we could commonly see injuries in. I don't care about muscles in, what's the smallest ab called? I don't care about that. I care about things that are pertinent to us. So I don't expect you to memorize all 600 of these muscles, but muscles have important functions for us as human beings because they give us the ability to move. They give us the ability to perform certain functions, the ability to maintain the posture that we have, as well as heat production. So when we talk about the body trying to maintain some sort of homeostasis, trying to maintain some balance, we have to have muscle mass. If we don't, then we can essentially watch the body just start to go into shock, and these patients become hypothermic just because they don't have the muscles to be able to shiver, which is going to make us heat up in theory. When it comes to muscles and how they function, there's some key things here I want you to remember because it's going to play a kind of a role when we start to talk about cardiology as well. Excitability, so which is really the ability to kind of get cells around it excited. It's also the ability to respond to a certain stimuli. So, if we give epinephrine, this is the ability for that muscle to then get excited, such as the heart. It's going to start to pump faster. It's going to start to squeeze. It's going to start to change how it functions just based off of medication. Contractility. Think of a rubber band. When we talk about contractility, if I pull a rubber band back really far and let go, I'm probably going to shoot it a little bit further. If I barely pull the rubber band back, it's kind of going to fall right in front of me. So our muscles have to have some level of contractility to them. Extensibility, absolutely, because think of your elbow. If I need to grab a cup of water that's in front of me, my muscles are assisting along with my joints, ligaments, and tendons for me to be able to grab that cup of water off the desk. And then elasticity, they can't be just solid and have no movement to them. They have to be able to somewhat change their shape a little bit just based off of functions that we are performing in our everyday lives. Just like our tissues, just like our bones, our muscles made up of literally thousands of threads, hundreds of threads. Now, when I think of threads, think of a blanket again. I know I said that last week, but think of a blanket. A blanket isn't just appear like that, right? It has different threads that have to be sewn together for it to become a blanket. And that's very much how it is with almost everything inside of our body, from layers of blood vessels to bones to muscles to tissues. We're very much layered. Now, are there different parts of the muscle that might be thicker? Sure. The outer layer of a muscle is going to be almost like your protective layer, just like anything else in our body. Like the outer layer of our body is our skin. It's our first line barrier against any sort of foreign invader. The outside of our, another good example here? Outside of our blood vessels, it is the toughest, as opposed to the inside of our blood vessels, which is going to be a lot softer and more permeable. So the outside of our blood vessels are going to be the area that's going to fight off any sort of liquid trying to get in, or any sort of infection or cells trying to get in at that point. So there are layers to our muscles as well. Obviously, during contraction, if we were to like flex our muscles, our tendons are going to help us out a little bit. Our tendons are going to help us, think elbow, radius, ulna, you got your humerus. If I need to flex my arm, I need to pull my lower arm towards me. It's not just a bone free floating, being able to do that. We have to have that rubber band. We have to have something that is giving tension for it to work. And again, I'm not going to beat a dead horse with this. We probably all know how a tendon works, but I can't bend my arm in the opposite direction because that tendon is holding it. If that tendon wasn't, my arm might be able to literally bend backwards just because it doesn't have that resistance that is pushing against it at that point. Again, some of the common muscles I'm going to want you to know are some of the ones listed here. And they're ones that we can also have as sites for medication delivery. Pectoral muscles, trapezius muscles, your deltoid, biceps, triceps, quadriceps. Pretty common stuff. Again, there's 600 muscles. These are really the only ones that to me are pertinent, in my opinion, are pertinent to our education as a paramedic. So don't go diving into different types of books, looking at all the different types of muscles or why they are what they are, or what the exact function is of that muscle. Know some of the common muscles that we're going to deal with. They're the major muscle groups. There's different types of muscle. There's smooth muscle, there's striated muscle, which is what we're going to talk about here. So striated muscle is really, it's almost got like grooves to it. It's got filaments, if you will. Now, the skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are both like this. Think of like a piece of steak, a raw piece of steak you get from the store before you throw it on your grill, before you throw it in a pan, however you cook your steak, I don't care. But it's not just a red blob. It's not just a pink blob. There is texture to it. There's almost like a grain, right? Meat runs in a certain direction. That's very much what striated muscle is. It is that it has some texture to it, and it has a specific grain, if you will, in a direction that it's going to be running in. If you want to, I guess, dive into each single fiber, you're more than welcome. But you can kind of see it almost looks like the Twizzlers, like little pull-apart Twizzlers. I can't think what they're called, peel and pulls, maybe. The ones that you don't even peel, you just eat the whole thing how it sits. But that's kind of what our muscles look like. There's just all these different fibers lining it to give us that one large muscle or large muscle group. Now, how I get that our muscles work, I get that they have to contract, I get they have to extend, but there's a little bit more to it than that. We have to have neurons and cells that are dictating when that muscle should function or how that muscle is going to function. Now, all cells within our body are going to sit negatively charged, right around -90. For a muscle to perform an action, or for a muscle to move or contract or extend, it has to then become positively charged. That process is called depolarization. When we take something from a negatively charged state and make it into a positively charged state, we're depolarizing something. And again, that kind of is going to play a role when we talk about cardiology, because that's literally what we're watching on a 4-lead or on 12-lead. We can see somebody's heart. we're not looking at the actual contractions of their heart. We're looking at the electrical impulse of their heart. We're looking at that electrical current as it travels through the heart. So we always are going to stay in that resting state. And when we're in homeostasis, once we go to perform an action, the cells at that point are then going to become depolarized. Now, the cells also have to reset. We have to let them rest. At our resting state, when cells are resetting, that is called repolarizing. Repolarizing or resetting. That's where we're trying to return everything back to a perfectly balanced state. That's where we're trying to return everything back to a homeostatic environment, if you will. Depending on which muscle group we're talking about, which ligament we're talking about, which extremity, whatever it might be in the body, it's going to have specific functions or specific ways in which it can operate, in which it can perform functions. I can't think of an extremity or an appendage or anything that we can literally move in every single direction on our body. Think of your fingers. Can I, by command, just by like trying to, without forcing it, can I bend my fingers backwards? You might be one of those people that's double jointed. That's kind of weird. Maybe you can, I don't know. But our body is only meant to move in certain positions. It's only meant to bend in certain ways. It's only supposed to flex in certain ways. That's because we have ligaments in our skeletal structure and our muscle structure, which allows it to only connect and operate in the way that it does. I know I talked just briefly about ATP last week, ATP being adenosine triphosphate, which is very much energy. When you hear ATP, I want you to think, no, that is energy. Now, there's two things that comprise energy. We have glucose and we have oxygen. When the body is going to work in a state without oxygen, it's called anaerobic metabolism. When it operates in a state with oxygen, we're talking about an aerobic metabolism. Body can operate for so long without oxygen in that anaerobic state, but at some point the body is going to get tired and not be able to refill its stores because there's a lack of oxygen. This might be somebody in CO poisoning. They have a reduced oxygen state. This might be somebody who's exhausted. This could be somebody that's overworked. Just something that is depleting their oxygen stores, where their body has to then just try to burn glucose as energy alone. But our body very much relies on ATP for everything. Every function you can think of, ATP is the fuel that drives us as an engine. As we increase workload, as we increase demand, we have to be able to increase the supply. If somebody is having a heart attack or somebody is having a STEMI, we're trying to keep their heart rate lower. We're not trying to elevate their heart rate. We're not trying to get them worked up, because that would increase their oxygen demand. That's fine. We can give them oxygen all day long, but they have a blockage in one of their vessels in the heart. They're not going to be able to process that oxygen. So we have to know that as the patient becomes more worked up, as the muscle becomes more worked up, it's going to require more oxygen. And when we don't have that oxygen to give it, it's what's called oxygen debt. And as oxygen debt begins to occur, that's when the body starts to go into anaerobic metabolism. Now, when muscles start to become damaged, muscles start to tear, muscles start to wear down, they release lactic acid. Hence why if you go work out, lift a bunch of weights, run, whatever it might be, and you get sore, you're not sore from the strenuous exercise, you're sore from the tearing of muscle fibers, and they're releasing that lactic acid in response to the tearing. Another time we'll see lactic acid release is during like crush injuries. You have somebody that's pinned between something or pinned underneath something. Their muscles are going to start to release lactic acid. So a lot of times what we'll see done is to counter that acidity, the patient might be given something such as sodium bicarb to try and change their pH just a little bit before they are unpinned, or whatever object is holding them down, or whatever object is crushing them. Before that's moved, they might consider something like sodium bicarb just to reduce the level of acidity that the body has released at that point. Talk about muscle fatigue, which I just discussed. So for our body to regulate heat, again, we have to have muscle mass, but for our body to shiver, we have to have fuel. We have to be able to fuel our muscles to say, okay, you know what, our temperature is a little bit lower than normal. I need to shiver. That'll hopefully raise my temperature through friction, through activity, but I need fuel to do it. I need the energy to be able to make my muscles function. Hence ATP, adenosine triphosphate. If we are in that state without ATP, we might not be able to perform everyday functions, perform normal body functions that we don't even know that is happening in our body on a normal basis. At any given time, I don't care if you're sleeping, I don't care if you're resting, whatever it might be, even though you think you're resting, all these different body systems inside of us are still functioning. They still require energy, they still require oxygen, they still require glucose. So making sure that we're fueling us as machines is also pretty vital and pretty important, and making sure that we're getting the nutrients that we need. One of the most complex things we're going to talk about tonight is the nervous system and how the nervous system functions. So the nervous system being comprised of our brain, which is housed inside of our skull, almost like a protective measure, our spinal cord, which is protected by our spinal vertebrae, and the nerves that branch off of our spinal cord to allow us to perform functions. This is really the sender and the receiver of all actions within inside the body, of all thoughts, of all behavior. This is how all actions are going to be carried out. Is a signal has to be sent from the brain down our spinal cord to the nerves, then that a signal will be carried to whatever body system we're trying to get to operate, telling it what we want done at that point. There's a lot of systems that are going to be working together hand in hand. Now, if you're in pain, if you get cold, if you get hot, those are all functions that your nervous system is monitoring. And your nervous system has responses to some of these things. For example, you're in your kitchen, you turn your stove on, you're not paying attention, you put your hand down on your stove. The body's natural reaction is to flinch and pull away from it, because the body's natural reaction is to move away from the pain. That's the nervous system saying, okay, I'm getting pain in the hand. Let's send a signal to move the hand away from wherever it's on. That's it receiving the signal of pain, and that's it sending a signal saying, hey, move away from the pain. Kind of how the nervous system functions. Now, our concern with the nervous system is always going to be injury, especially when we're talking spinal cord or brain or nerves, especially in traumatic situations, car accidents, falls, because we're not so much worried about the vertebrae that protect them. We're more worried about the spinal cord itself. And how severely damaged is it? Are they still going to be able to function? Are they still going to have function in certain areas? Is this a case where the patient might have some level of paralysis? Now, our nervous system is divided into two systems. We have our central nervous system, which is going to control most of our commands, like body, like if I'm telling the body to do something. Also, it's going to process information. So information that is sent through our nerves, through our reflexes, that's going to be received by the central nervous system, and then it's going to be able to send a signal to do something else. Now, our peripheral nervous system is the one that has to work a little bit more. It's kind of like the worker bee of the colony here. It has to perform functions that you want it to, that are sent down through the central nervous system. So again, I want to grab my glass of water off my table. That is a voluntary function. I want to be able to do that. Now, there are involuntary functions, and those are controlled by our autonomic nervous system, such as breathing, blinking, salivation. Can I hold my breath? Yeah, but that is not a passive reaction. I have to force myself to hold my breath. My body doesn't do it naturally. Think of your digestive tract. We're not telling our intestines, we're not telling our stomach when to start to process food. It's just something that is done automatically. So that is going to be controlled by our autonomic nervous system. Just kind of a breakdown if you're more of a visual learner. Your central nervous system, again, brain and spinal cord, is going to be sending your signals, receiving signals, and commanding the body what to do. Versus our peripheral nervous system, which is going to control our voluntary and involuntary functions. And even further, if you want to get down to our autonomic nervous system, you've got your parasympathetic and sympathetic systems. So your fight and flight, or your rest and digest. This is where some people get a little confused, and this is where it starts to get dry, in my opinion. So bear with me, please. Don't come to the computer and slap me. For the body to be able to send and receive signals, for the body to be able to perform daily functions, normal functions that we don't even think of, that we just do on a daily basis, we have to have these neurons, these nerve cells. Just like everything else, a bunch of these get together and they're going to perform alike functions. Now, we have to feed these cells. What do we feed them with? Well, we feed them with oxygen and glucose mainly, but there are other nutrients that are needed for them to function. But when you think of these cells, or you think of these neurons as like a little circular cell, if you will, you're going to have the cell body, which is the circular part of the cell we can think of if we're just envisioning what they look like. We're almost going to have these little hair-like fibers that come off of them, almost like little feelers. Those are what's called dendrites. And those are what's going to be sending the signal from one cell to the other. That's how they're able to communicate to each other. And then we have our axon, which is more like the pathway that the signal has to follow. It's going to be like the opening or the entrance or the exit for signals to be sent or received. Again, visual learners, there's some pictures. Now, you're going to notice in that top picture, it almost looks like these little hot dog shaped items between our neuron and our fibers. That's literally the highway that signals are traveling on. Usually that is lined with something called myelin. So it's actually called your myelin sheath. But that is the highway in which signals are sent and signals are received. So if I want to grab my glass of water, I have to send a signal from my neuron down to my muscle fibers to say, hey, go ahead and function. If my hand touches the burner, my muscle fibers, my hand is going to send a signal back up to my motor neuron saying, hey, I feel pain. Then we're going to send a signal. It's just constant communication back and forth. And there's our myelin sheath that I was talking about, almost like these hot dog Twinkie shaped objects, if you will, which act very much as our highway, sending and receiving signals. That's why they're connected. Signal starts and one is literally going to jump through until it reaches the destination that it's looking for. Now, there are periods of gaps. Like if you look, they're not perfectly touching each other, but there are gaps. Now, where the gaps are, that's what's called a synapsis gap or synaptic gap. That gap is usually filled in with fluid. Why is it filled in with fluid? Well, think of a toaster in a bathtub. If I throw a toaster into a bathtub, is it going to positively charge the water in the bathtub? Yeah, absolutely it will. It's the same concept here. Once those cells become negative or positively charged and they're trying to send a signal, that fluid will become positively charged and excite all the cells around it. There's going to be a ton of different types of neurotransmitters, whether they're natural to our body or whether it's a transmitter that we are injecting into a patient, such as medication. There's going to be two different types. One that's going to cause a reaction, so it's going to be excitatory, or one that's going to stop a reaction or stop an action, which is going to be inhibitory. So if I want to raise somebody's blood pressure and I give dopamine, I'm exciting those cells. Now I want to paralyze somebody, like for RSI, I am inhibiting those cells. I'm preventing something from happening. So exciting is to initiate the impulse, as to where inhibit is to stop the impulse. Now, sure, there are medications that might slow or stop it, but they are working in towards one or the other. I talked about layering. Everything has layers. Their central nervous system has a lot of fail safes when it comes to security and trying to keep itself safe. First one being bone. Bone is going to be really a huge protector for, think of a lot of our organs. So we have our vertebrae in our back, to protect our spinal cord. We have our thoracic rib cage, which can protect a lot of our organs inside of our chest. We have our skull, which protects our brain. A lot of bones are also protecting blood vessels. So if we get a fracture, there's always a concern right there in a certain area that maybe there's a potential for a bleed, such as your pelvis, such as your femur. So your bone is going to be more than just protecting your central nervous system. We have what's called meninges, which is going to be almost like the layers of tissue that are going to sit on top of your brain. Cerebral spinal fluid. As EMTs, we're always taught, hey, we're looking for fluid leaking out of people's ears. Okay, if I don't see any fluid leaking out of anybody's ear, then I'm guessing they don't have any sort of brain trauma, right? That's not always the case. CSF is generally caused, if we can see it, it's usually caused by some sort of skull fracture, where the brain is just free floating in this fluid. It almost acts as a cushion. Think of you underwater. If you go to move your hand as fast as you can underwater, you're truly still not moving at the speed you want to. It's slowing it down. It's almost acting as a cushion. That's what CFS does with inside of our skull. It acts almost as a cushion for our brain as well. And then we have what's called the blood-brain barrier, which again is going to act as an extra layer of protection, that layer of blood that just kind of almost free floats on top of our brain. The different layers I'm talking about. So your bone is going to be probably the thickest one that we're going to encounter. Your cranium, your skull, your vertebral column, which is going to wrap around your spinal cord. Our meninges, the different layers of our meninges. So you're going to have your duramater, which is going to be your most outer layer, your arachnoid layer, which is going to be like middle, and then your pia mater, which is going to be like the layer closest to the brain. If I had to say something that would kind of maybe ring a bell, if somebody has a brain bleed and they're told they have a subarachnoid bleed, that's going to be below the arachnoid tissue. There's some sort of bleed. We're just literally referring to tissues of the brain. So duramater, arachnoid mater, or pia mater. Again, just like any other tissues, think like an onion, very much layered. Parts of the brain that I would probably spend the most time on, if you're going to memorize any of them, are the 4 that are listed there, because they're going to control most of the functions that our body does, either voluntary or involuntary. So we have cerebrum, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum, and I'll talk about each one just kind of briefly. So our cerebrum is going to control any major muscle movements, automatic movements such as breathing, even specific body movements such as me wanting to do something. Things really associated with skeletal muscles is going to be controlled by our cerebrum. It's also a pretty large part of our brain. It covers a large mass, or a large piece of real estate that envelopes our brain. Now we have our diencephalon. This is going to include some of your glands, like your thalamus, your hypothalamus, your subthalamus. Main job of this is to really filter out any unnecessary information that it doesn't think you need. So a good example would be, you're looking around in your room, you lost your pencil, you're looking for your pencil. Your brain is filtering out everything you're looking at because it's trying to focus in on one thing. That is what your diencephalon is going to be doing, is it's literally taking all this millions of pieces of information that you're taking in by looking around, and it's trying to filter it down to process and figure out what it's truly looking at. Our brainstem, which is at the bottom of our brain, obviously the part right there in yellow. This is probably the one that we get the most worried about, I'd say, in trauma, because it sits literally right above a hole in a skull. So if pressure rises in our head, the brain could want to push out of that hole, thereby pushing pressure on our brainstem. But the brainstem controls things such as maintaining a level of consciousness, maintaining a certain level of hemodynamic stability, so trying to maintain blood pressure, bodily functions that we need to survive. Vital body functions are controlled by our brainstem. And then we have our cerebellum, which is going to be more fine motor skills, the ability to grasp something, the ability to squeeze something, the ability to touch your fingertips together, as opposed to our cerebrum, which is going to be more mass motor functioning. So talking about our glands a little bit, I mentioned that these are going to be housed inside of our diencephalon because they're filtering out information. body temperature and thermal regulation, when we're trying to maintain some level of normalcy, is controlled by our hypothalamus. That's where we are going to send and receive signals saying, I'm hot, I'm cold. What is my reaction to these temperature changes? Hypothalamus is going to be the gland that controls that. Now, referring to our glands again, there's going to be, when we talk about limbic systems, all part of the brain, all part of these glands that I'm referring to, thalamus, hypothalamus, all found inside that diencephalon. These are going to be some of the most major parts that you're going to have to identify a lot during paramedic school and even for testing reasons. Your limbic system is going to connect a lot of these together. It's almost like connective tissue, connecting these different parts of your brain. So it's going to connect your thalamus to your hypothalamus. It's going to connect the front of your brain to your temporal lobes, and it's going to control all that, or connect all that back to your cerebrum. So it's not just like our brain is all one part. It's very much almost a bunch of parts pushed together and held together. And the thing that holds it together is very much this limbic system. And it's going to, again, allow the brain to work in coordination with each other. That's what gives us fine motor movement. That's what gives us higher thoughts. That's what gives us being able to react to emotions, is that our brain can work in coordination with a different part of our brain. So the limbic system is primarily responsible, and I just said it, for dealing with emotions, for dealing, how am I going to react to emotions? What is my behavior response going to be to a certain emotion? This is also the part of the body that starts looking at self-preservation. So what do I need to maintain life? What do I need to do for myself to maintain life? So it's kind of like the selfish part of your brain. Our spinal cord, it's not just kind of like a tail. It's not just a cord. It has all these things. If you were to think of like a tree root, it has all these little fibers that are branching off it that are spread throughout our body, because again, it's sending and receiving signals down these highways, sending signals that, okay, I need to walk, I need to breathe, I need to blink my eyes, I need to sleep. Everything you can think of is sent up and down through our spinal cord. It's very much just a highway to send and receive signals. Passes from the bottom of our brain stem through the hole in our skull, which is called the foramen magnum, about the level of T4, or thoracic 4 is about the top of their armpits. If you can see there where the crease is on either side. Our biggest concern there is if there's any sort of injury, we can see the patient potentially become paralyzed at that region, which means maybe the patient stops breathing. Maybe this is a patient that ends up on a ventilator. When we start to talk about a little bit further down, maybe near the patient's belly button, if we're worried about a spinal cord injury there, maybe that's lower leg paralysis. Maybe that's a patient that has no function below the level of the belly button at this point, meaning this is a patient that's potentially on, or has an ostomy bag. This is a patient that potentially has a catheter just based off of injuries to the spinal cord. Again, it's not our vertebrae, it's not the bones we're worried about in a back injury. It's the spinal cord itself, which is protected and housed by that vertebrae. All right, I'm going to give you guys, let's see, I'll give you guys 10 minutes. So 6:45, we're going to keep jumping into this. As we get to easier stuff, I'll lower your breaks down, but take a 10-minute break, 6:45, and then we'll carry on with our slideshow. All right, since some of this stuff is kind of dry, so kind of bland, I'm trying to give you guys a break every half hour. So like 7:15, I'm gonna send you guys off for another break. We're gonna see how far we can get in that time frame. So peripheral nervous system. So not our central nervous system, peripheral. So muscle movement, bodily functions, broken down into two different categories. We have our voluntary, such as our somatic. We have our involuntary, such as our autonomic. Our autonomic is also broke down into two categories because we can't control this. We can't control our fight or flight system, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Parasympathetic being our rest and digest, but we can put ourselves in situations that make these systems kick in, such as going skydiving. That's going to make my sympathetic system kick in. Such as taking a sleeping medication, that might make my parasympathetic nervous system kick in. So it is autonomic, but there are medications, there are things that we can do that would essentially make the system kick in or make the system function depending on what we give the patient, or depending on what we as people take, or what medications or what activities we perform. Something that's pretty important, that's why it's highlighted in red for you guys, is our cranial nerves. Why they're important is because they control and they filter out a lot of the information that we are, what's the word I'm looking for, that we are obtaining on at any given moment. So such as sight, such as sound, taste, hearing. These are all nerves within inside of our brain, and the roles they play are kind of important. And knowing the order and knowing the names, I would probably write some of this stuff down. So these are going to be your 12 optic nerves, all the ones listed on the right hand side here, and I'm going to kind of tell you what each one does. So our first one at the very top being our olfactory nerve, which is going to be the nerve that controls and gives us a sense of smell, for us to be able to smell things. And this is looking at the brain from the underside. Right there, we can see the brainstem. We can see our cerebellum, which is the back underside of the brain. So we're looking at the brain from the bottom up. But our first one, olfactory nerve, sense of smell. Second one, our optic nerve. This is the sense of sight, for us to be able to see things. Pretty common, pretty easy. Third one, ocular motor. This is going to be limited eye movement, also our eyelids and pupil size. So when our fight or flight system kicks in, or when our parasympathetic system kicks in, it's going to change our pupil size depending on what our body's doing, if we need to see more or if we need to see less. The fourth one being our trochlear nerve. This is going to be moving our eyes up and down. So for our eyes to move up and down, it's going to be our trochlear nerve. The one underneath that, our trigeminal nerve, number 5, is going to be for chewing, is going to be for reflexes or sensations in our face, reflexes or functions of our jaw. Our sixth one is going to be our abducens nerve. This is going to be moving our eyes side to side. So our trochlear moves up and down. Abducens is side to side with our eyes. Our seventh one, facial nerve, is going to be any facial expressions. This could be blinking. This is going to be crying. This is going to be salivation or producing saliva. Taste. So our taste buds are technically part of our facial nerve. Our eighth one is going to be our vestibulocochlear nerve, which gives us a sense of hearing, if you've ever heard like a cochlear implant. And it's also going to give us a sense of balance. Somebody that has vertigo, or somebody that has a really bad ear infection, probably is going to have some balance issues, just because the tubes and the canals within our ears allow us to maintain our balance. So your eighth one is going to be controlling hearing and balance. Our ninth one is our glossopharyngeal nerve. This is going to be swallowing. This is also going to be movement of our tongue. So not just swallowing, movement of our tongue. 10th one is our vagus nerve. Why our vagus nerve is important is because it's going to help with our parasympathetic system. It's going to slow down our breathing. It's going to make our muscles relax. It's going to slow down our heart rate. If you've ever heard of somebody vagling down, That's your vagus nerve. That's what's happening, is they've kicked in, they've excited their vagus nerve. Number 11 is an accessory nerve, which involves using, like, turning your head side to side, using your shoulders. And then number 12 is going to be your hypoglossal, which is responsible for speech and forming words, which also means that our tongue is somewhat involved, because we need our tongue to speak. So out of the 12 cranial nerves, whatever you need to do to remember them, I don't care, but you need to know your cranial nerves and what they're doing, not where they're at. You probably don't even know where they're at, just what function they serve and what body sense or what sense of the body they are assisting with. Our sympathetic and parasympathetic systems underneath our autonomic nervous system. Again, the two chemical messengers of each one of these systems. So our sympathetic is going to be norepinephrine or epinephrine. Adrenaline is going to be the chemical messenger for sympathetic, because it raises blood pressure, it gets somebody amped up. As to where our parasympathetic system is going to be acetylcholine. It's going to calm somebody down. It's going to dilate their pupils. It's going to lower their blood pressure. It's going to make them a little bit more relaxed at that point. But again, those are just chemical messengers. All they're doing is it's a messenger cell telling the body to kick in. Can we give those same medications? We can give epi all day long. We can give a medication to slow somebody down and calm them down, such as Versed, such as Valium, such as Ativan. So we can give medications to mimic some of these processes as well. Here's what I'll tell you about sensory function without reading verbatim on a slide. When we talk about your central nervous system and neurons and your body's ability to just perform normal daily functions, it's all about sending and receiving signals. It's your body being able to realize that it needs to perform a function, and your body telling your brain that something is changing. When it gets cold outside, that's your body telling your brain, hey, it's cold. Your brain then tells your body, hey, start shivering. It's just constant talking back and forth. But to send messages and to receive messages, there has to be almost like a mailbox, like a receptor site, right? Now, for these receptor sites to function how they should, there have to be messengers that fit perfectly in those receptor sites. Some of the receptor sites that we're going to see, depending on the tissue or depending on what's going on with the patient, ones that are monitoring pain, ones that are monitoring temperature, such as your thermoreceptors, mechanoreceptors. So when we talk about like physical properties, if, a good example would be like a broken bone. Well, so the two most common ones we're going to be thinking of, baroreceptors, change in pressure, very much plays a role in our lungs when our lungs expand. And then chemoreceptors, again, think oxygenation status. Our body tries to compensate when we have a high end tidal reading. Our body tries to compensate when we have a low end tidal reading, because those chemoreceptors are picking up on carbon dioxide. All right, our endocrine system. I'm not going to talk the whole time. Somebody tell me about the endocrine system. What does it do? What are some functions of the endocrine system? It could be the easiest one you can think of.
Regulates hormones.
Okay, regulates hormones. In regards to hormones, what are hormones? What are they responsible for? What are some hormones that you can think of? What hormones do males carry that females don't, and then vice versa?
Testosterone and estrogen.
Yeah, males are going to carry testosterone, females are going to carry estrogen. Big hormone difference, but those are hormones specific to the sex of the person that we're talking about, or the person that's in question. Now, some other hormones that we can think of, melatonin is technically a hormone. There's going to be hormones that change behavior. There's going to be hormones that make us happy. There's going to be hormones that make us sad. So they're very much just messengers. They're just chemical messengers telling our body to do a certain function, to perform a certain way. Other messengers that we could commonly see are neurotransmitters, ions, growth factors. The ones that we're primarily going to be dealing with as paramedics are neurotransmitters and hormones. Neurotransmitters and hormones also can be synthetic, such as medications that we're going to give. Can we give medications to make people calm down? Yeah. Can we give medications to make somebody maybe not as sad? Sure, depending on the situation. But we're cloning what the body naturally has, making it into a synthetic material that we can inject and hope that the body reacts to it in a positive way. All right, so some of the glands in the endocrine system and the hormones that they're going to be producing. So the first one is our hypothalamus. I know I highlighted it in red because I said that it regulated body temperature earlier, helps with thermoregulation, but some of the other things that that is under its control. Blood pressure, pretty important. Heart rate, blood glucose levels, all these things are essential to life. If my blood pressure drops, my patient can go unconscious or unresponsive. My heart rate drops, the same. Blood glucose levels drop, same. So the hypothalamus is one of the big glands that we should probably know a little bit about, or know at least what functions are under its control. We have our pituitary gland, also called the master gland. The reason it's called the master gland is because the hormones that it produces. So first one is it produces growth hormone, also known as GH, which is going to give us growth spurts. It's going to allow our bones to grow. It's going to allow our muscles to grow. It's going to allow us to grow from children into adults. We have TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. Depending on the person, they could have thyroid issues. They could have a thyroid that's hyperactive. They could have a thyroid that's a little bit slower. That's also going to play a role in how well their metabolism is working. Another one that the pituitary gland is going to produce is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is a weird one, just because we kind of know oxytocin as a medication that can induce labor, but it can also stop labor. You know, a lot of pre-hospital services used to carry a drug called Pitocin, and they carried it to stop bleeding post-birth if they were to deliver a child in the field, because what it does is it stimulates uterine contractions. But the body naturally produces that as well in the form of oxytocin. Now, if a medication starts something and stops something, that means it probably has a really, really big therapeutic index, kind of like dopamine. Dopamine has a dose of 2 to 20. Low dose dopamine can actually cause your blood pressure to drop. High dose dopamine causes your blood pressure to raise. So it has a pretty wide therapeutic index. That can also be bad for us, because if we get our dosage wrong, we could see the opposite effect of what we want with our patients. Some of the other things the pituitary gland is going to control. Why it's called the master gland. So melatonin. What's melatonin good for? For our skin. It's going to help us with our sleep cycle. We have ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So if a patient begins to go into shock, the body releases ADH, which tells the kidneys to stop doing their job, because we're trying to retain as much fluid as possible. ACTH, which is essentially adrenaline, released by our adrenal glands on top of our kidneys. And also the pituitary gland is going to produce like our reproductive hormones. So the reason it's called the master gland is because all of these functions that it does. So if you are ever asked about something about the master gland, they're referring to the pituitary gland.
So, Rudy, I have a question.
Yeah.
This might sound kind of dumb, but if you're having a thyroid issue, why do they medicate you to try and control the thyroid when it's actually the pituitary gland that's affecting the thyroid?
Well, because it might not be the actual gland itself, it might be the thyroid. And the reason, so they'll run you under a couple different tests, and they're looking to see if you have an overactive thyroid or if you have an underactive thyroid. And a lot of that will also come down to, I know I mentioned it earlier, but your metabolism. And we look at something called your BMR, your basic metabolic rate. And what that is it tells how quickly you are burning calories just at a resting state. Now, if your BMR does not exceed what you're intaking in calories, then obviously the excess calories are going to turn to mass or turn to tissue or turn to fat. So if you have a really slow BMR and you're not eating a whole lot, that's where they'll look and be like, this seems to be a thyroid issue. So they'll run tests and to see if your pituitary gland is putting off the hormones it should first. And if it is, that's how they determine it's a thyroid issue, not a pituitary gland issue. Okay. Is they just look and see if the hormones are being released correctly. There's a whole lot of testing that goes into it. Some people end up having their thyroid removed, but it just really depends on what's going on with them. I'd say 9 times out of 10 is more of a thyroid issue than it is a pituitary issue.
Okay. I got my thyroid out when I was 14. And it was never really explained to me. It was just done. So I was kind of curious of
do you
how
know,
they determined that.
You don't know why?
I know I was super hyperactive. So like I was losing weight, growing extremely fast, and tired all the time and emotional.
Yeah. And so if you look at a lot of these hormones too, I mean, so growing really fast, you had, we're talking growth hormones, GH, really hyperactive. So again, adrenaline released. So even though it is some hormones produced by the pituitary gland, it's really the thyroid that is managing them, if that makes sense. Yeah, the pituitary gland produces them, but the thyroid is actually managing it. If I know that's kind of hard to explain, but TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, can actually inhibit growth. It can inhibit the way that we eat, can inhibit the way we retain water. So it's hard telling without running a whole lot of tests what's truly going on with somebody. But yeah, a lot of times if you have an overactive thyroid, those are people that are really skinny or losing weight very rapidly. They're usually very hyper, as opposed to somebody that has a underactive thyroid. This is somebody that is usually pretty obese, not really active. Also, on the other hand, doesn't really eat a lot. It's just their body can't process what they do eat because their metabolism isn't functioning at the rate it should. That's why somebody with really fast metabolism can go eat 10 pounds of food at a buffet and never gain a pound. I go in there, even stare at a crab rangoon, and I'm probably going to gain 5 pounds. So it really all comes down to the hormones within our body, and a lot of that's hereditary as well. Do your parents have any like gland issues, do you know of, or like did they have any issues with the thyroid?
My parents directly no, but I do have some cousins on my mom's side who have hypo while I was hyper.
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah.
So do you have a scar where they remove your thyroid in your neck?
Yes.
Okay. That's actually, since it was the next slide, I had to ask. So yeah, your thyroid can be removed if they determine that your thyroid is causing hyperactivity or underactivity. The problem with hyperactivity is that you're also going to see continually high blood pressure, a continually high heart rate, as well as other vital signs as well. You know, I've talked about COVID before, and some of the patients that we were seeing go into thyroid storms, and it was because their thyroid became super overactive trying to fight off a whole bunch of infections that it essentially killed them, because their blood pressure was raising, their temperature was raising, their heart rate was racing, and it was all caused by their thyroid. So whenever we see a patient that potentially has their vital signs severely elevated like that, and we're not sure what's going on, a lot of times we can trace that back to a thyroid issue. And most of the time that's what they call a thyroid storm. Yeah, and so these are all things that you've mentioned: growth, development, metabolism. Metabolism is going to play a role in how well we're gaining or holding on to weight. Thymus, when you think thymus gland, I want you to think of immune system disorders. So allergies, usually identified in our childhoods, but not always. You can have allergies that you develop later on. I never had a problem with allergies as a kid, but I developed, seasonal allergies the older I got. The job of the thymus gland is to really just help the immune system see if there's a problem. The first time that there's an allergen introduced to the immune system, it tries to identify it. It doesn't attack it because it doesn't know what it is yet. Now, the second time it sees that same thing, it's kind of developed a plan to how to kill this guy if it sees it again. That's when it starts to attack. The first time is when we see if there's a reaction. The second time is when our body reacts to it. Our pancreas, super important, because we're going to see a lot of patients that we could see a chief complaint of low blood sugar or high blood sugar. So our pancreas is going to be responsible for producing insulin and producing glucagon. Now, I know glucagon and glycogen and glucose, they all sound like sugar, right? Glucagon is nothing more than a messenger. So we have these stores of sugar, or a reserve, that is stored in the liver, is stored in the kidneys. And when our body senses that our sugar is getting low, it releases glucagon, which again is like a messenger. It tells the body, hey, we need to release those glycogen stores. Okay, great. The body releases them, our blood sugar rises. In the event that we do not have glucagon, or our blood sugar is too low to where glucagon can't do its job, that's where we start to see people go into a diabetic coma, or the blood sugar drops really low. Hence why a lot of services carry a glucagon pen. We're not giving them sugar, we're introducing the messenger, telling their body to, hey, release the glucose stores that you have built up, release those glycogen stores. That's why glucagon takes a little bit longer to work, because we're not directly raising their blood sugar. We're telling their body to do it on their own. But there are the patients that can't, that maybe don't have the stores built up. You'll see that a lot with maybe pancreatic cancer patients as well. Our adrenal glands sit right on top of our kidneys. The hormone that they're going to release, the chemical messenger that they're going to deal with, is adrenaline, hence adrenal gland. It's also going to secrete our sexual hormones, cortisol, so steroids, as well as assist with maintenance and balance of fluid, such as salt and water. Remember, water will follow salt in where it goes. So if we see that we're retaining too much water, our body might naturally try to flush out all the sodium within its system, in hopes that the fluid will then follow the sodium out. Now, when we talk about certain steroids, or we talk about certain hormones, almost all the ones that we are going to be referring to are going to help manage glucose in one way or another, whether they're managing glycogen stores or they're managing blood glucose levels. They're all going to have a hand in managing with each other. Cortisol just happens to be a big one, because it's going to manage the blood levels of glucose in your blood, not stores of glycogen, not glucagon, but glucose itself, so sugar within the bloodstream itself. Another thing that'll help with is how your body uses glucose. You know, it's almost going to assist your body or assist your body in pushing glucose to the muscles that need it, and pushing glucose to the organ systems that are requiring it. Maybe there's an infection, maybe the body's trying to fight something off. Those areas are going to take a lot more glucose than other areas. If you ever seen somebody in the ICU and they're super sick, a lot of times they're hanging a bag of D5, and that's because the patient's body is literally like the Energizer Bunny, just burning through sugar because they're fighting off infection. Hence why they'll hang a bag of just, you know, a small amount of sugar, just to try to keep that level. But cortisol is going to help shift that glucose to where it needs to be at that point. Our pineal gland is going to be responsible for melatonin. So with that means that it's going to help us with our sleep cycle. It's, you know, when we have somebody that maybe can't sleep at night, or somebody that maybe works nights instead of days, their body is going to change how it releases melatonin after a certain period of time, because their body will become adjusted. It's also going to work with other systems in the body, such as, you know, when we have daylight savings time, our body, which is, the system is called the reticular activating system. When it senses darkness, our body says, oh, it must be getting close to bedtime. Our body will slowly start to release melatonin. Well, as the days get longer and it's still light outside, our body doesn't think it's time to go to sleep yet, so it doesn't release any melatonin. But there's body systems in conjunction with each other to make sure that happens. So it's not just our our pineal gland just releasing melatonin at any given time. There's other systems that are identifying when it should be releasing the melatonin. Hence, why people have trouble sleeping at night, or why people have trouble staying awake, just because maybe they have a hormone imbalance in regards to melatonin. Our circulatory system, we literally are going to spend 6 to 7 weeks in cardiology next week or next semester. But a closed loop system, there is no opening. If we had an opening, then we have a bleed of some sort. We have our pulmonary circulation, so where we're circulating from the heart to the lungs and then back, and then we have everything else. Everything else is what's called systemic circulation. So we're moving blood throughout our body systems. So between the heart and the lungs is pulmonary, everything else is systemic. Actually, we're going to go to like 720, so that way I can get through some more of these slides. Blood, we know blood is responsible for carrying nutrients. It's responsible for carrying hormones. It's responsible for carrying things such as fibrin to help with clotting. But blood is produced by bone marrow. Blood is also responsible for carrying oxygen. So if we have a patient in a traumatic situation that has lost a lot of blood, we can see their pulse ox reduced just because they lack now the oxygen carrying capability. Some of the other tissues where blood can be produced is some of our lymphoid tissues. So our thymus can assist with blood production, as well as our lymph nodes and our spleen. We can also store blood in those areas. If somebody gets really super sick and they get swollen lymph nodes, that's because the lymph nodes have become inflamed with blood at that point. If somebody gets a spleen lac or a cut to their spleen, maybe due to trauma or whatever, spleens bleed a lot because it is a storage place for blood. It is almost like a little reserve that we have within our body. Spleen, very much a solid organ. It's not hollow. It won't collapse. But its job, it filters and breaks down red blood cells. It looks at which ones are at their end of their life cycle and tells the body, hey, we should be producing new blood cells at this point. So it's very much responsible for maintaining that balance of homeostasis and fighting, I wouldn't say fighting, but almost acting as a I'll skip that part, but it's going to be telling our body, hey, I need more red blood cells to fight this, or I need less red blood cells because the infection isn't existing anymore. Now, if somebody has a problem with their spleen, can we see certain conditions such as, blood thinning disorders or blood clotting disorders? Yeah, absolutely you can. But the spleen is mainly for filtering. But if we see splenic problems, then we can see hormonal problems as well. And we can also see conditions such as hemophilia. We can see conditions such as sickle cell. Those can be caused by spleen disorders, believe it or not. So what is our blood comprised of? Mostly liquid, right? It's not solid. We know that just by looking at blood. 55% of it is plasma. 45% of it is nutrients and cellular fragments. Now, of that plasma, 92% of it is water. 7% proteins, such as fibrinogen, which is pretty important in our clotting factors. The rest is things that we commonly think of that blood carries: oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, electrolytes, vitamins. If our blood is mostly water, it's really easily thinned out. It's already somewhat thin. By introducing a whole bunch of saline to our patients, we are reducing its capacity to carry these other nutrients. That's why we try to maintain just a normal blood pressure, or in a traumatic situation or a patient is in shock, we have permissive hypotension. We try to keep a blood pressure at like 80, 90 systolic and not anymore. Not for the simple fact that we're trying to, promote clotting, but also we're trying to maintain the blood's oxygen and nutrient carrying capabilities. If somebody gets a bruise, say you get a bruise from something, I don't care. Say you get hit with a I don't know, a baseball. What's happening when you're bruising? Like what is that? You might know. It's really red blood cells rushing to the area, right? It's not that they're rushing on purpose, but those capillary beds right underneath our skin are very permeable. So when they become damaged by whatever trauma, they tend to release whatever is inside them. Most of the time that is blood, hence why blood rises to the surface and we develop a bruise. Blood cells are also called erythrocytes. So if you ever see the word erythrocyte, what they're referring to is a red blood cell. Now, I get oxygen is carried by blood. Oxygen is bound to hemoglobin somewhat, but carbon monoxide is bound to hemoglobin 2 times more than oxygen is. So again, that patient that we have that has a pulse ox of 100% might not be 100% of oxygen. It might be saturated, but it's not 100% of oxygen. Hence the patient with CO poisoning after a house fire, or in a garage with some sort of gas powered equipment running. We check a pulse ox on them, it's normal. That's probably not truly what's going on. So we should be using pulse ox in conjunction with end tidal to determine if our patients are somewhat stable or determining their respiratory status. Some of the common tests that you'll see run, especially in the hospitals, so they'll run a red blood cell count. The reason they're doing that is because, again, there's hormones that tell the body to produce more red blood cells. There's things that tell the body to produce less. So there could be a problem with the body, not the blood. And they're trying to determine what's going on. Hemoglobin levels. Hemoglobin is important because it's going to carry oxygen. It's going to carry carbon monoxide. It's going to carry carbon dioxide. It's going to carry some nutrients. And we're also looking at the measurement of hematocrit. So if we think that somebody has maybe an internal bleed, they'll keep an eye on their HCT, their hematocrit, because they want to see if that level is changing over time. If that level continues to maybe decrease along with hemoglobin, that could indicate the patient has a slow bleed somewhere. But they're looking to see if the patient does have normal levels of clotting factors at that point. All right, before going on to white blood cells, take another 10 minutes. We'll say 7:27. We're over halfway through the slideshow, so I'm not too worried about time. So take 10 minutes. We'll come back. We'll finish white blood cells, and then we get into some of the easier stuff. All right, so we left off on red blood cells. Obviously, we have to talk about the white blood cells now. So white blood cells are probably the most important thing when it comes to dealing with any sort of infection, any sort of inflammatory response. They are what rush to the area to try to fight off, allergens, try to fight off septic materials, to try to fight off anything that is being counterproductive to our body, anything that is negatively impacting our body. The types of white blood cells we're commonly going to see, as I sit over here and have a stroke, the main one we're going to see is a neutrophil. A neutrophil is probably the most common, another thing that we're going to have the most of inside of our body. Their main job is to literally find and destroy bacteria. So it doesn't matter if it's an inflammatory response, such as allergies, or if it's maybe a cold or a flu. I'd say the next common one that we're going to see is a basophil. Common curriculum wise, it's going to be most common in allergic reactions. Its primary job is going to be allergic reactions. So a basophil contains something called histamine. Histamine is what gives us hives. It's what can give us kind of like a red color. A lymphocyte, the smallest of the white blood cells. When we think of lymphocytes, there's going to be 2 different types. We've got T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. When I was going to paramedic school, this was like the hardest part. I was like, how do I memorize T, B, A, C, right? Just know that a lymphocyte is a type of attacker white blood cell, and their main job is to fight bacterial and viral infections. They're really small because they have to fight really small invaders. I don't care if you remember that T versus B. but they are both working in conjunction to fight bacteria and viral infections. A monocyte is going to be, instead of attacking it, it's going to like swallow it. It's going to find its whatever it's going up against and essentially take it over, like literally swallow it. Its cell will then merge with that cell, and that's how it attacks. It attacks it from the inside, as opposed to just destroying it. Platelets, we know that we need to have these circulating in our blood volume to assist with clotting. Now, the main things that we have as far as nutrients or as far as enzymes within our body is we have plasminogen, we have fibrin, and we have thromboplastin. Their main job is to literally look for damage and try and repair it, or look where blood is escaping and try and form a clot in that region. Hence why we develop a scab if we skin our leg or we skin part of our arm. What happens when you pull the scab off? Well, you start to bleed again. We also have to have adequate numbers of adequate numbers of calcium. Calcium is what is really going to act as the glue for fibrin and plasminogen and thromboplastin. It's going to be the glue that holds these nutrients together to give it that wall, to give it to where no blood is escaping out at that point. Now, we have clot busters, right? So say a clot forms where we don't want it to, such as somebody having a ischemic stroke, or somebody having maybe some sort of other coronary artery disease, or whatever it might be, where there's a clot, we're trying to bust it up. It could be in the lungs, it could be a PE, whatever it might be. We have fibrinolytics. Remember, anything that ends in lytic is usually trying to inhibit or stop or prevent. So we have fibrinolytics that we can give, such as TPA, to bust up clots. But most of the time when the body is forming natural clots, it's to try and fix something, as opposed to when we have massive amounts of fatty deposits that turn into plaque, that turn into a clot. This would be the blood naturally clotting. Now, can the blood naturally clot for no reason? Absolutely. People have disorders that to where their body just wants to clot all the time. So those patients are more than likely placed on blood thinners. Now, another problem is that, okay, we're worried about trauma in those patients. We're worried about fall risks. We're worried about basic everyday life. And if they bump into something, or if they drop something on their toe, we're always worried about patients on blood thinners. Our lymphatic system is very much part of our circulatory system. Its job is to try and remove excess tissues from the body, or not tissues, fluid from the tissues. So say we have a patient that has CHF, they have really bad edema in their lower extremities. They have, +2, +3 pitting edema, where you can push your finger in and you can leave a dent in it. The lymphatic system is going to try and remove that water through filtration. What it's going to try and do is flush out all the salt that's in our body, in hopes that that fluid will then leave the tissues, enter the bloodstream, and try to follow the salt out. But does that always happen? No. But that's why most of the time, patients that have severe CHF or severe edema are on some type of water pill, is because we're trying to flush out their system at that point. Now, the liquid that assists us in the lymphatic system in acting as almost like an usher for fluid is what's called lymph. It is kind of a viscous solution, if you will, that is going to sit all inside of our body tissues. It almost acts as like a little barrier, a little gel-like barrier that's going to assist us in removing fluid through a permeable membrane, and also not allowing fluid in. If I need to get rid of excess fluid, it doesn't just like disappear, poof. It doesn't go into our blood vessels and then just like go down out of our urine. No, that's not how it works. Our arteries and our veins are connected through something called a capillary bed. It's almost like a spider web. It's when they get down so small that there's such minute pressure that they literally become intertwined. Now, what happens is when our body needs to get rid of this excess fluid in our tissues, it deposits this fluid into our bloodstream in hopes that when it gets down to this capillary membrane, it is then carried over from arteries to veins, veins to arteries, whatever it might be. So that way it is pushed through the system to either help with functioning because it's, again, a fluid, or to be excreted out of the body through the kidneys, where they're going to be filtering. And when they pick up something they don't like, they're going to rob the nutrients from it. Everything else is then turned into urine at that point. Fluid will not be pushed into the body, into the tissues by the lymphatic system. Its literal only job is to pull tissues or pull liquid out of the tissues, not push it in. And most of the time, again, for us, we're going to see this in CHF patients. Now, where we could do our patients some harm is when we start fluid overloading them. Now, yeah, you could have a CHF patient that has pitting edema that maybe has a low blood pressure, sure, because that fluid isn't in their vessels, it's in their tissues. We might need to give them a little bit of fluid. When this isn't the patient we're opening fluid up all the way on, but we might need to give them a little bit of maintenance infusion. But we need to be very careful, and we're listening to lung sounds while we're doing this, because we do not want to oversaturate these patients with fluid, because they already have such a massive buildup. I spoke a little bit about our spleen. It's going to act as our filter, right, for our blood. It's going to take what nutrients it wants out of old blood before it's put back into circulation, and it's going to metabolize them. It's going to take what it needs, such as, calcium, magnesium, all these different either neurotransmitters or vitamins within inside of our body, macronutrients versus micronutrients, which we're going to get to here in a couple slides. It's going to take what it wants, and the rest gets filtered out. It either gets put back into circulation, or it gets put back, or it gets excreted out of the body, depending on what the body decides at that time. If it decides that, hey, you know what, we've got some issues going on here, we need to get rid of some fluid, it's probably going to excrete it. Now, if it decides that we're in shock, it's going to stop what it's doing, and it's going to return that fluid back to circulation, because we're trying to hold on to as much fluid as possible in that instance. We're literally just going through different systems of the body now. So don't, like, if it looks like it's jumping around, it is, because it's just going through different systems. We talked a little bit about inhalation when we went through the respiratory system. So when we inhale, negative pressure is what drives that. When we inhale, our diaphragm lowers. Through negative pressure, we're able to pull air into our lungs. That's what's called Boyle's law, when we are able to use negative pressure to pull air into our lungs. Now, when we exhale, it's our diaphragm rising, pushing the air out of our lungs. A lot of people think it'd be the opposite, but it's literally your diaphragm moving up to kind of compress your lungs to push the air out. Kind of like if I was to put pressure on something, it's going to try and force whatever liquid or whatever substance is in whatever I'm pushing on. It's going to try to force that out at that point. Visual learners, here you go. As I inhale, my diaphragm lowers, allows my lungs to fill with air. As I exhale, my diaphragm raises, allows my lungs to then become collapsed, getting rid of everything. Now, do we truly get rid of all of our air? No. We always have some residual capacity, because that's how we keep our alveoli opening. That's how we keep our alveoli from collapsing. So we will never truly get rid of all of our air. Now, we do have certain receptors within our lungs, such as stretch receptors. If my body determines that I've breathed in too much air and my lungs are overinflating, it will cause me to cough, in hopes that I'm expelling air when I'm doing that. That's what's called the Herring-Brewer reflex. It'll also look at levels of carbon dioxide. If my respiratory system sees that I have a high level of carbon dioxide, it's going to breathe faster because it's trying to blow it off. If it sees I have a low level, it's going to try and breathe slower to try and raise my carbon dioxide level through chemical messengers, through little chemical receptors. It's literally looking, its only job is to look and monitor that pressure. If it sees a change, it reports it back through sending and receiving, and our body then changes its function and tries to compensate for it. If we want to look at a true reading of oxygen and a true reading of carbon dioxide, what we'll do is we'll draw labs. We'll draw an ABG. We don't, but we'll look at the ABG. What we're looking at is partial pressure of oxygen and partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Usually you're going to see PCO2, PO2, or PaO2 and PaCO2. PCO2 and PO2 is just partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the vessels. PaO2 and PaCO2 is partial pressure of the arteries. So that's what we're seeing in an ABG versus just running a CBC or a complete blood count. I talked about our Herring-Brewer reflex when lungs are inflated. If our pH is skewed, remember pH scale 7.35, 7.45 is our normal range. If we are below 7.35, we are acidic. If we are above 7.45, we become alkalytic, more of a base at that point. Our body will try to compensate by changing our respiratory pattern and by kicking in our renal system. So if my body sees that I'm very acidic, it will try to blow off the excess acid by raising my respiratory rate, such as what we see in like Kussmaul respirations. It doesn't raise the rate, but it raises the depth. So in Kussmaul respiration, somebody who has DKA, blood sugar is like 600, 700, we'll say. We smell that fruity acetone in their breath, and they have very deep, kind of long respirations. Their body is trying to blow off that excess ketones. Also, those are the patients that have to pee a lot because their body is trying to get rid of the excess acid, hence why they have to pee a lot. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, think of a diabetic who has low blood sugar or is trending low. They are going to start to breathe really slow and really shallow because their body is trying to make them acidic. And you're not going to see them want to urinate. You're going to see them wanting to drink a whole lot of water. It's just what we call the buffer system. It's our body trying to compensate. Our body is all the time just trying to maintain homeostasis. Our digestive system, responsible for ingestion of foods, the mechanical processing and stealing of the nutrients, digestion, secretion of these nutrients, absorption into the bloodstream, and then excretion of whatever is left over at that point. Some of the things that will assist us in this process, so salivary glands with saliva is going to help us assist us with eating. Our stomach, which is going to be the first step in starting to tear down contents, through stomach acid. Our liver, which is going to act very much as a filter. Our pancreas, which again is going to help with the production of insulin and glucose or glucagon. And then our small intestine, which is the beginning of our intestinal tract. Now, our small intestine is robbing nutrients, as to where our large intestine is robbing fluid. So small intestine pulls nutrients, large intestine pulls fluid. Now, its job is to take nutrients and try to convert them into basic building blocks of life, basic sugars, acids that we can use for energy, amino acids for growing. Now, if we eat or we have a diet that is very sugar heavy, depending on the sugar, our body might not be able to process it correctly. It's looking for simple sugars. It's looking to break things down into simple sugars. Skittles aren't simple sugars. If you look at the ingredients on a package of Skittles, it has like galactose, fructose, sucrose. It has all different types of sugar because it's a complex sugar. It's very hard for the body to break that down. It'll rob what it can, but the rest just gets excreted. That's why if we have a patient who's a diabetic, we bring their blood sugar up, we have them eat a simple carb or a simple sugar, peanut butter and jelly, bread. Carbs break down into sugars. I think I said that last week. Our body needs simple ones, not complex ones, not nerds, not Skittles, not sour Skittles. It needs things such as fruits. Glucose tubes, little tubes of gel, that's a simple sugar. When we refer to the alimentary canal, what we're referring to is where does our digestive system begin and where does it end? So it begins with our mouth with the ingestion of foods, and it ends when we excrete all the food, when we excrete all the waste. And then we have the parts in between, such as our pharynx, which is going to be right above our esophagus. Our esophagus transcends and goes into our stomach. It's almost a straight shot into our stomach where the breakdown process of food begins. From there, it travels to our small intestine where we are able to rob the macronutrients and the micronutrients that our body needs. It's then going to go to our large intestine where fluids are going to be pulled out that our body might need. And then it's going to be travel through our rectum where it's then excreted out into waste. Now, our digestive system, just like any other tissue in our body, just like bones, just like muscles, everything has layers to it. And the different layers that you'll see is, for one, your mucosal membrane, the innermost layer, your submucosa, and then your serosa. Again, I don't expect you to memorize which one's which. Just know that it has layers. That ridge almost on top, your mesentery, what that houses is your mesenteric artery. Your mesenteric artery is responsible for supplying blood to your digestive tract. So if somebody has a really bad stomach bleed or like an arterial bleed in their stomach, most of the time it's from that mesenteric artery. Or if they have trauma, it's usually that mesenteric artery that's ruptured. Think our digestive tract, our intestines are very much muscles. If you look at that picture there, on the inside of the tract, you see how there's like ridges. Think of how like a worm crawls, how it kind of like shortens itself up and then extends itself out, shortens itself up, extends itself out. That's how our intestines work to pass food. It's just constantly extending and retracting, to move food from the beginning all the way until it's excreted. Now, things that also assist our digestive system: our teeth for chewing food, our tongue, which is going to help us with swallowing, salivary glands, so it's going to help us with saliva, again, assisting us with moving food down our esophagus into our stomach, our liver, which is going to act as a filter, our gallbladder, which is going to help with bile storage. So those stomach acids have to go somewhere. Those stomach acids are turned into bile and then stored in our gallbladder. And then our pancreas, which is going to help with our regulation of blood sugar. If there's something that you need to know, you need, whatever way you can, remember how your organs sit inside your abdomen. Know your quadrants: your right upper quadrant, your right lower quadrant, left upper and left lower. Easy way for me to remember was GLASS, which is gallbladder, liver, appendix, spleen, stomach. So if I start in my upper right quadrant, if you feel like your own upper right quadrant, your gallbladder, your liver is going to sit right kind of like in front and below it, but your liver sits across. It's not just in one quadrant. Below that, in my right lower, I have my appendix, hence why people get appendix pain, right and low. We'll have our spleen in the upper left, and then our stomach is going to be right in front of our spleen. That's how I remember it, as GLASS. That works for some people it doesn't. Some people find their own way of doing it, but that's never failed me, to be honest. Something that we can see with gallbladder too, since it's going to be storing bile and like fatty acids. If you have somebody that has a really fatty diet, like eats nothing but fatty foods, they can get really bad stomach pain or really bad abdominal pain or chest pain. And what's happening is that their gallbladder is full and their gallbladder is stretching, almost like, it's a hollow organ, it's going to stretch. So what happens is that organ gets so full that it emits pain, and it can feel very much like cardiac pain. Esophagus, this goes without saying, it's going to bring food from our mouth to our stomach. In layman's terms, I'm not going to make it any harder than that. Yeah. Stomach job is to receive food, store it, start to break it down, and then pass it to our small intestine, where nutrients are then going to be robbed at that point. What's funny is we have a lot of intestines inside of us. And I think in the slide coming up, it'll tell us roughly 20 feet of just small intestine alone, not counting large intestine. But you can kind of see what I was talking about, almost like the muscle structures on the outside of the intestine and how it functions, kind of like a worm, how it just contracts and extends, contracts and extends. Now, the beginning of your small intestine is what's called the duodenum. That's really where, if you look at this left picture, food is going to start to come from the stomach into the small intestine. The middle of this intestinal tract is what's called the jejunum. And then the end is what's called the ileum. So your beginning and your middle and your end in regards to your small intestinal tract. Now, your large intestine isn't just right below your small intestine. It's almost surrounding it because, again, we're dealing with a storage issue here. We don't have a ton of room. So it almost sits right around your small intestine. And again, its job is to rob fluids. Your small intestine robs nutrients, robs solids. That's where your large intestine is going to pull out any fluid that it thinks it might be able to use before excreting it out of the body. Our liver is going to assist with blood glucose maintenance, detoxifying blood. That's why if somebody who's a very chronic alcoholic can start to have liver issues, they can start to have a fatty liver because their liver just isn't able to process it at some point. It's going to assist us with clotting. Hence why some chronic alcoholics also have a problem with their blood being thin. Since it does maintain blood glucose as well. If you remember me talking at one point about somebody who is a chronic alcoholic, we might end up giving them dextrose and vitamin B. And that's just because it will assist their body in breaking down the alcohol because they're not getting the nutrients they need. They're malnourished. So we'll give them vitamin B to assist with the glucose being absorbed into their body in hopes their body can then start to break down the alcohol, start to break down whatever nutrients it needs to at that point. Our gallbladder, reservoir for bile. That fatty acid that comes from the liver is deposited in the bile. It's also deposited through the intestinal tract from the stomach. It has to go somewhere. It just isn't excreted out of us. That is all stored in the gallbladder. It's almost like I can feel you guys getting tired. It's very odd feeling. Pancreas, glucagon, insulin. So it's going to assist with, again, maintenance of blood sugar. Now, this is kind of important. Macronutrients versus macronutrients versus micronutrients. If anybody has ever been on any sort of diet where they had to count their calories or they had to count certain parts of, count their macros, they're looking at carbs, they're looking at fats, they're looking at proteins, they're looking at sugars. Those are macronutrients. Macronutrients are a little bit larger, hence macro versus micro, but they are the things that are going to provide energy to the body. As to where a micronutrients is more of a vitamin or a mineral. It's something that is allowing a chemical reaction. A macronutrients is needed for energy. Micronutrients is a vitamin. If we continually eat complex carbs or complex sugars, our body doesn't know what to do with that. So it stores it as fat. It takes what it can as simple sugars and the rest gets turned into fat. Hence, people that eat a lot of carbs, they tend to gain some weight. People that eat a lot of candy, they tend to gain some weight. It's because their body doesn't know what to do with it and just stores it. And it can't really be broken down. It's really not sure. That's why those people also that eat high sugar contents also have usually bowel issues, just because what's being excreted. Now, when our body runs out of carbs, when our body cannot use carbs for energy anymore, it has no more carbs to break down to sugar, the body then turns to fat and it turns to amino acids. When it does that, it starts breaking down its fat stores. That's why people will go on a low carb diet, or that's why people will go on a keto diet, is they're limiting the amount of carbs they're bringing in because their body will now start to turn to fat and break down their fat and use their fat as energy instead of carbohydrates. That's why those people have almost a fruity smelling breath, a keto breath, is because they're getting rid of excess ketones, very much like a DKA patient. Their body's trying to blow off those excess ketones. They're putting their body into a state of ketosis. Some excess sugar stored in liver and muscles. Again, that's what our glycogen stores are. To get that to release, we have to have glucagon produced by the pancreas, or us as pre-hospital providers might carry glucagon to administer so that those glycogen stores can be released, so the body can naturally raise the blood sugar up instead of just giving dextrose. The bad part about dextrose is it spikes blood sugar, so the blood sugar is really quick to crash at the same point. Glucagon is more of a it's not long-term, but it's a longer lasting process because it's the body naturally doing it. We've got 9 slides left. I'm going to fly through the urinary system here. It's going to control waste within the body. It's also going to help regulate the pH system. So our body takes what it wants to out of our fluids. Anything that's left over is then pushed through our urinary system and is filtered through by our kidneys. So it begins with our kidneys filtering out what it doesn't need or what it wants to keep. That fluid then passes down to our ureters, which are tubes that go from our kidneys down to our bladder. Now, our bladder very much has stretch receptors. Once our bladder becomes full to a point, those receptors start alarming and tell us, hey, I need to go use the bathroom. We then go run to the bathroom, and that fluid is excreted out of us through our urethra. The only way it is helping maintain pH is by trying to get rid of excess acid. That's it. It's trying to get rid of what it can. Now, in terms of shock, the body releases something called ADH, which I talked about earlier with our pituitary gland, antidiuretic hormone. When ADH is released, it tells our kidneys to stop functioning. It tells our bodies, hey, hold on to everything that you have because the body's going into shock, our blood pressure is low. We need to hold on to as much fluid as possible. Inside of our kidneys, we have these little filters. These little filters are called nephrons. So our big filter, which is our kidney, is made up of a bunch of little filters called nephrons. Well, these nephrons are responsible for taking in fluid, robbing the nutrients, wasting the products it doesn't want, reabsorbing as much water as possible because our body likes water, as well as electrolytes. If you look, there's something called the loop of Henle, and that's literally where our nephron has a loop. Why that's important is that's where water is reabsorbed. That's where the process reabsorbs water. Well, if I give somebody a medication such as Lasix, it is a loop diuretic. So it only works on that loop of Henle. It prevents reabsorption of water. It tells the loop, hey, you're done working for today. Any water trying to get in, you're just going to get excreted out. Hence what a water pill is. A loop diuretic works on the loop of Henle. We have what's called our GFR, our glomerular, I can't pronounce it. GFR is our filtration rate by our kidneys. Some people's filtration rate will be greater, some will be not as great. Now, in patients that don't have a great GFR rate, they're not filtering like they should, or they're not filtering fast enough, they can develop kidney stones because they have this uric acid that is building up inside their kidneys. And then after a period of time, it starts to clog those tubes leading to our bladder, which leads to kidney stones. And it's just usually a buildup of acids, of uric crystals that is creating this kidney stone. But the GFR is just how quickly our body is filtering liquids. So if we drink alcohol, we actually increase our GFR, hence why we have to pee all the time. Okay. Urine, 95% water. The rest is generally uric acid. Unless we don't drink a lot of water, then it's mostly uric acid and not as much water. And then our concern there is the buildup and potential for kidney stones. Maybe, people drink a lot of pop, drink things that are high in sweets that aren't simple sugars. The body has to do something with that. And most of the time it's really high in uric acid, which will lead to problems down the line for our urinary system. Ureters are the tubes that go from our kidneys down to our bladder. I literally just said that. Our bladder is hollow. It is not solid. And again, once we hit these certain receptors, once our bladder starts to fill up, it sends a signal to our brain, central nervous system. Hey, I'm full. What do you want me to do? Brain sends a signal back. Hey, go use the bathroom. That's how we function. We send and receive signals constantly. And then once we go to the bathroom, we excrete it all through our urethra, which is the same male or female. It doesn't matter. Inside our urethra and our ureters and our bladder and our kidneys all follow the same track. Anatomy wise, obviously it's different, but our urethra is going to be the same. It doesn't matter who it is. It's called the same thing. All right. That was exhausting. That's actually our last slide. So I'm going to go ahead and